So today I'm going to be talking about prompt prototyping. Thanks for having me. It's really a pleasure to be here. I had a great day so far talking with folks. A lot of people working with large language models. GPT-3 and ChatGPT came up in a lot of the conversations. It's really interesting to see how these new technologies are. I'm going to be talking a lot about that in my talk today. So I want to create 3 AI prototypes in 3 minutes. Say I want to create an English to French translator. Well, with a model like GPT-3, I can write a prompt like this: English hello, French bonjour, English apple, and then French colon. And this is just text. There's nothing special about it. And if I send it to a large language model, it's likely to come back with the French translation of PUM. Okay? If you're not familiar with large language models, they're kind of like autocomplete, like a super powerful version of autocomplete. And so with that example, it picked up on the pattern and figured out, all right, well, the next most logical thing or most probable thing following the text that's already been entered is the French word for apple. So in the time it would take you to go and type in that example, you would have created a basic English to French translator. It's not going to be state-of-the-art in performance, but it will work well enough that you have a functional prototype for English to French. So that's one example. Next example, say I wanted to do English to Python. I could do the same pattern. I could write English print hello world, Python print hello world, English open the file apple.txt for writing, and then Python colon. And again, if I send that to a large language model, I'm likely to get the correct Python code for opening up a text file for writing to it. You note it has the correct flag of W to indicate that you want to open the file for writing. Let's do the third prototype. Now I want to figure out what food pairs with apples. I can type in something like this: food, white wine, pair with fish. Food, apples, pair with, any guesses for what? Cheese. Yes. We have a large language model in the audience. So it can pair with cheese. And so now we have a prototype of an AI that can provide suggestions for pairing foods. And again, you can do this in the time it takes for you to type in these examples. This is amazing, I think. What we're seeing is that these large language models empower a very large, new, diverse group of people. So software engineers, UXers, so designers, product managers, to rapidly prototype AI in minutes. Okay? And it requires very little prior machine learning experience. Right? As soon as you figure out the notion of prompting, you can start prototyping AI. This is very powerful. I've said in other contexts, what we've seen in the past is you've had this large cohort of people who have been standing on the sidelines, who wanted to be actively involved in prototyping AI, but they couldn't because they didn't know how to program, they didn't have the experience with machine learning. Now they can do that with prompt prototyping, or with prompt programming. Another way, or another thing that's interesting about this is that you can go from the concept to something functional in very little time, and you can get it into the hands of users very quickly, right? So you can start testing these ideas out in person in very little time. So we call this prompt prototyping, and really we want to evoke this notion of paper prototyping, right? So you can think of prompt prototyping as akin to paper prototyping for AI. Right? You can sketch something out with your prompt, get it in the hands of users, and you can have those users actually play around with the prompt itself. One of the things I like to say with prompting is one of the most difficult things about learning how to prompt is understanding how difficult it really isn't. You know, when you say to people like, hey, I can teach you how to go and prototype AI, they're like, okay, this sounds like it's going to be complex. And I say, no, look, here's the examples. And it takes them a while for it to click that that's it, that's all I need to do. So it's interesting that the biggest hurdle is just kind of overcoming preconceived notions of how difficult this is. Okay, so these capabilities are leading to new HCI prototyping possibilities, and we'll talk about some of these, and new social dynamics and how prototypes are created, and how people interact with one another as they're prototyping. And it's also leading to new LLM prototyping patterns, some of which I heard actually being used with folks I chatted with today. And I think some of these will make a lot of intuitive sense when you see them. All right, so today, in the rest of the talk, I'll give you a quick overview of PAIR, the People in AI Research Group. We'll sketch out a basic LLM design space. And then we'll report some results from a case study of looking at how people are prototyping with LLMs in practice. And then I'll conclude with some of these prompt prototyping patterns we've seen to be useful and opportunities for future work. I'm told that questions are usually come at the end, but do feel free to ask questions throughout. I'm happy to go and take questions. It makes it much more interesting if you can ask the question in the moment. All right, so a very quick whirlwind tour of PAIR. There are about 25 to 30 of us now within Google Research, and we have lots of great collaborators. We're a mixture of research scientists, software engineers, UXers, designers. And we have three focus areas for our work, really all under this theme of exploring the human side of AI. We do work in tools and frameworks, foundational research, and education. So to give you some examples, in the tools, we've built things like the Learning Interpretability tool, previously known as the Language Interpretability tool. TensorFlow.js also came out of PAIR. We have these annual sprints, and a few engineers said, I wonder if we could create a deep learning library that runs in JavaScript. And that came out and developed into TensorFlow.js. We also have a number of educational materials, some of which you may have seen. There's the PAIR Guidebook, which provides advice for designing with AI. And then there are AI Explorables, which are these interactive narratives that describe complex or tricky, nuanced topics in AI in a very interactive, approachable way. And then we do foundational research. And I mentioned we're a multidisciplinary team, and we have researchers who focus on machine learning research as well as human-computer interaction research. So you see us publishing at venues in both of those areas. And also producing work that straddles both of these areas of both foundational research and tools. One of the recent outputs is WordCraft, which is a tool to assist with writing that's backed by a large language model. And I think I heard recently that you also had some speakers on this topic. You may be interested in checking out WordCraft. They did a writer's workshop where they had professional writers use the tool for, I think, a few months, or at least they had the tool available to them for a few months. And they reflected on what worked and what didn't work well when working within a large language model. All right, so we started the talk by going over some quick prototypes that you could create with a large language model. Let's just start to sketch a design space for what you can prototype with large language models. And this is from work that we had at a NeurIPS workshop a few months ago. So generative models can do a lot. And you may be familiar with this paper talking about foundational models, which provides a really nice view of all the different perspectives that can be brought to bear when thinking about these large models. In this talk, we're really going to be focusing on them as a prototyping medium for human-computer interaction. So as a prototyping medium, we can consider a couple different dimensions. So we can ask, well, what kinds of things can be prototyped? And then where in the prototyping process can prompting be used? So what can you prototype? So this is not an exhaustive list, but it gives you some indication of the different types of things that you can prototype. I think a lot of people, when they hear LLMs, they start thinking of, I can use it for creative tasks, like for helping with creative writing, right? Or they think of ChatGPT, like I can interact with it as a chat agent. But you can do a lot of different things. You can prototype a lot of different things. So you can create a classifier, right? So you can ask, is this word a fruit? Or given this shopping list, which of these things are fruits, which of these things are vegetables. You can do information extraction. So like I just mentioned, you can go and have it pull out information from a larger text. There's transformation. We saw this with the English to Python example. So you can do things like English to French, English to Python, so transformation or translation of content. There's interpretation, and you can see the boundaries here are not crisp, but these different lenses, I think, are useful to think through the different possibilities. There's creativity support tools that we talked about. There's some interesting work that folks may have seen coming out of Stanford where they're starting to use them to simulate social communities. So if I wanted to create a new subreddit and I wanted to understand what are the different types of conversations that might occur in that subreddit and how might those conversations inform a policy, well, you can use an LLM to start to simulate conversations before getting people into that community and waiting to see what things might emerge. So you might be able to get an early insight by using an LLM as opposed to just trying to deploy and then saying, okay, well, what actually is happening? There are recommender systems, so there's the food pairing recommendation, but you can do a lot of different types of recommendations. Summarization is very popular. A lot of people think about large language models for summarizing. And then question answering. So again, not exhaustive, but you can see there's a lot of different things that you can think about prototyping with a large language model. And again, you don't even need to code to go and get a functional prototype up and running with these different ideas. Where can you use these in the prototyping process? I talked about this notion of thinking about LLMs and prompt prototyping as a kind of like a paper prototyping for AI. You can take advantage of that capability to go and co-create with your users, right? So I have this idea of this application. Let's go and try it out. If it doesn't quite work, they might be able to get in there and play with the prompt a bit to go and craft or tune the interaction a bit more to what they actually want or need. You can, like I said earlier, you can also get a prototype up and running and get in the hands of users very quickly, right? In the past, it might take 4 to 6 months to go and create a model. Now you can do this in a matter of minutes or hours. That means you can get a functional prototype done that much faster and get it into the hands of people to figure out, is this even a good idea? And then you can take these things and throw them into experiments, right? Actually run some studies. Compare it with the best state of the art to see, like, are we actually seeing something interesting and noteworthy with the interaction that we've developed? So that should give you a sense of, like, here are the range of things you can do. Again, beyond just things like generating creative content or chatting. Lots of different possibilities. So now we can ask, well, how is this changing prototyping? And so I want to talk about this case study that we did and published at Chi Case Studies last year. So we have this tool internal to Google called Promptmaker. It's a tool for writing prompts. So you can write prompts, you can parameterize them with variables, you can expose an endpoint so that you can access that prompt through JavaScript to make it much easier to embed into a functional prototype. You can save the prompts, you can share them. So we have a lot of people within Google who are now using this to go and rapidly prototype and share the results with other folks. And given this, we wanted to understand how it was changing people's practices. So we did a case study where we interviewed 11 different practitioners. There was 8 from a sprint involving large language models and 3 from a participatory workshop. And the interviews included designers, program managers, content strategists, and front-end software engineers. And what do we find? So I'll give you a summary and dig into the details here. So what we found is that prompting dramatically reduced the machine learning model prototyping time. Again, from months to minutes or hours. And enabled early intuitions about what might be possible. It enabled non-ML experts to be more self-sufficient. And then we found that the prompts served as boundary objects between different disciplines. So let's dive into these in a bit more detail. Before prompting was available, you had people describing the situation of creating machine learning like this. You have a pen and paper idea. You'll play with it using sheets or slides or pen, paper, scissors. But as soon as you have to write code, the process slows down. Someone has to write a backend and a server, and everyone needs to have a Linux box. So you can feel kind of like the frustration of what the process looked like before. But now, they say, we thought about natural language queries for a particular product idea. 15 minutes later, we had a working example of natural language structured queries. And we see this repeatedly where people, so to use our tool, people have to request access and say why they're requesting access. And we see lots of ideas coming out, and people can prototype these ideas very, very quickly now, whereas they couldn't before. We're also seeing, again, this early intuition that people can start to develop about the feasibility of an idea. So previously, they described the process of like this. It was sort of a process of interrogation, not of the model itself, but of the people who had the ability to understand it or who created it. Right? And so this, again, is speaking to the experience of people who are not experts with machine learning. They don't know what's possible. And so to understand, is this product idea even within the realm of feasibility, they would have to go and find the expert. They would have to sit down, talk through the idea, and see, like, is there something there? Will this actually work or not? But now with prompting, they note that being able to play around with the model directly and get a sense of what things are easy and what things are hard is just so much more useful than a wishful thinking sample dialogue. And I've heard this sentiment from a lot of different people. I was talking with someone the other day who said, I'm interested in the large language models, and this is like a director level person, and how we might be able to use them. And so I just started playing with it because it makes it much easier for me to understand what's possible to directly interact with it, like to see, is this area of research or this area of work possible, or should we consider something else? We also observed this decreased reliance and bottlenecking on machine learning engineers, very much related to what we were just saying. So previously, they said we spend a long time trying to find the machine learning researchers. We don't have a lot of machine learning engineers on our team. So even just finding the experts was a challenge. Now, with the prompting, they are, again, able to do some of the experiments themselves without having to bother a bunch of software engineers. So it's really useful. And you can start to see it's changing the social dynamics a bit, right? And so there is this, decreased reliance on others and more of a sense of self-sufficiency and self-reliance. And then finally, there's this idea of the prompts grounding communication between machine learning engineers and researchers and non-machine learning collaborators. And so you have this idea of the prompts themselves as being boundary objects. So previously, they talked about, if they had an idea and they wanted to communicate to machine learning researchers, they had to write a big, long doc, multiple pages, like a deck or a document. But now, they say, I was referencing something, but the software engineer, could then use it. It was a common material that we were both using. This is really important in terms of increasing that velocity, right? So you can say, okay, I'm thinking of doing X, Y, or Z, and beyond just that, you can say, here's the prompt, right? Go and play with it, try it out. Again, they can iterate together and have a common understanding of precisely what it is that it's trying to do. All right, so in summary, we saw that prompting dramatically reduced the machine learning model prototyping time. It enabled non-machine learning experts to be self-sufficient. So you started to see the social component. And then a grounded communication between designers and machine learning developers. Again, this social component. To me, this kind of fascinates me that the social dynamics are changing because of prompting. Previously, again, you had this reliance. You had to go and find the experts. You had to convince them to spend time with you to talk through an idea. And now people are able to go and test these things out themselves. There are interesting side effects of that as well, right? People might get an existence proof of like this works, but then they may also come away with a bit of a false sense of confidence of like, okay, well, I've shown that it can work here in the prompt. Let's just go and get this into the real world. With less of an understanding of what it takes to actually take that idea and then put it into a reliable format that can be used by lots of people. All right. And again, linking back to this notion of paper prototyping, I do see this interesting connection or analogy to paper prototyping. With prompting, you can quickly generate multiple alternatives, right? So it doesn't take a whole lot of time to type something in. Again, compare this with the previous situation where you would have to invest significant resources to build a model to test something out. Now you can say, like, all right, maybe we want to have the AI do this, or maybe we want to have it do that. So you can test out qualitatively different ways that AI can inject into a particular interaction, right? That gives you a lot of power and flexibility that you didn't have before. It's accessible. Again, anyone can kind of quickly sketch, critique, and edit something. You can share these things, and then it affords lightweight testing. I think this is one of the superpowers that's often overlooked with prompting. You can develop that prototype that much faster. You can get in the hands of the users. You can figure out what are the tricky things that will pop up in this interaction that I don't even know about. A lot of people ask, what about, this questions of responsible AI or bias? And I think this gives you one of a very powerful tool to go and flesh those issues out much sooner than you could before, right? You might have, for example, the idea of an application where you want to help kids take natural language and then write code for a web app. That idea might be good, it may not be good, right? But being able to develop that prototype that much faster and get in the hands of your target users to figure out what issues am I not even thinking about right now is really powerful. And it's something to really lean into, I think, with prompting. All right, so I've given you a sketch of the prototyping possibilities, a design space, and then some of the things that we've seen with prompting used in practice. Let's talk about a few prompt prototyping patterns that we found to be useful. And these come from some papers that I actually heard people citing today, which was fun and interesting. So AI chains at Chi, prompt chainer also at Chi. And then I won't get to it, but if people are interested, we also did some work looking at how can we design APIs that are easy for LLMs to use. So right now, every software API that exists basically is designed to be easy or for a human to use. What changes if you want to design an API such that an LLM can easily produce code from a natural language request? How do those APIs look and differ from APIs designed for people? So you can start to think about API design, not just for people, but also for models that are generating code for you. Happy to chat about that more if people are interested in that work. If prompting can accelerate HCI prototyping, how can we further enrich the prototyper's palette? And importantly, what I'm going to be talking about today are not related to effective prompting techniques. It's not related to prompt engineering, but higher level prompting patterns involving prompts. So there's a lot of work that you can find on the web about different prompt engineering tricks that seem to work well. One that I mentioned earlier was this notion of chain of thought reasoning. If you haven't seen that, it's kind of interesting, where you ask the model to do something and say, walk me through it step by step. And asking it to solve a problem step by step often leads to higher quality results if you don't ask it to do the step-by-step thing. It's an interesting little trick that actually leads to better results. But I'm not going to talk about the prompt engineering stuff because that space is moving really quickly, and what works today may not really matter tomorrow. But I think these higher level patterns are likely to persist a bit more. All right, so, and you'll probably find these to be fairly common sense, but I think they're still useful to think about. So one is decomposition, another is a pattern we call a switchboard, and the third is a pattern we call phone a friend. So for decomposition, it's exactly what you might expect. rather than trying to solve everything with a single prompt, you can take your problem and break it up into multiple different prompts. Okay. So as an example, maybe I want to have the model create a series of flashcards to help me learn phrases in French. Now I might be able to write a prompt to say, go and give me a bunch of English and French pairs of phrases that are useful to know in France. It might be able to give me that information. But I might have better success if I ask it first to give me a set of things that I could do, or sorry, a set of phrases that I might want to ask or use in France, in a trip to France, and then to go and ask it to translate those from English to French. Okay. Another way to think about this is there's a lot of capability embedded within the model, but you might not be able to get at all of it in a single pass. So you can break up into smaller problems. So this is the notion of decomposition. Splitting the task into smaller self-contained tasks. So to take that example a bit further, again, I want to learn phrases for my trip to France. I can first ask the model, what are different topics? What are different chat topics that might be useful to know? And it can come back with examples like small talk, transportation, accommodation. Like these might be different areas. And then for each of those areas, I can ask, all right, what are example phrases in English? So do you like the weather? Where's the bus station? How do I get to the Louvre? I will check out at noon. And then for each of those, you can then ask the model to go and translate those from English into French. So this is the idea that we published in AI chains. What was interesting, so we did a study of AI chains compared to trying to get the same results with prompting. And what was interesting was that people felt that the chains were more transparent than just with the prompting. And again, what's interesting is we didn't provide any interpretability tool, any explainability, any insights into the model functionality. Instead, what we did is we broke the problem up into smaller pieces. And when the model failed at a particular point in the chain, people could see that and say, okay, it's failing there. Let me go and fix that part, or let me try a different approach. And so there was a sense of the entire process being more transparent than if you tried to get everything done in one go. So that's one side effect and an advantage of breaking things up is that there's this sense of it being easier to debug when you're not getting the result that you want. All right, the next pattern is the switchboard. So here, you can determine or classify the intent of the user and then route to an appropriate handler. One of the things that I often see is people trying to ask the model to produce factual information. And what you're asking the model to do is to first interpret what the user's asking for, and then to go and produce the factual information. So you have 2 points of failure there. At least two potential points of failure. If you can instead figure out what the user wants, then you can ask, how can you go and solve that problem? Not necessarily with the large language model. So you'll see this pattern and the next one really interact a bit, or interact a lot. So for the switchboard example, say that I want to have a chat-based music player, right? Where I want to allow the user to ask things like, play music by the Beatles, right? So they should be able to type that into the chatbot. Or maybe it should be able to provide information. So who are some country artists? Right? So here, I'm not asking it to go and play something, I'm asking it to get information. But the user may also ask things like, hey, what's up, that aren't really related to the music application. So for this type of application, we can first figure out what is it the user is trying to do. So again, taking this idea of chains, classifying their intent into one of these categories. Are they asking to play music? Are they asking for more information? Or are they asking for something out of scope of the application? And then once we make that determination, then we can route the request to the proper handler. And again, not trying to do everything all at once, right? Break it up into smaller pieces and then figure out where there are potential points of failure. The next pattern, phone a friend. Here, we are making use of auxiliary services to get information or to perform actions, all right? And again, you can think of the cases of like getting factual information. So instead of a factual information request, you can determine the intent, but instead of trying to provide that information, you can go out to an auxiliary service to get that for you. So going back to the music example, if we figure out that the person's asking for information about an artist, rather than trying to fill that request from the model, we can figure out what information are they requesting, extract that information. So going back to like the design space, we're doing information extraction. We're doing classification first and then information extraction. And then we're going out to a trusted resource, like a music information database. And we can either provide the information as is, or we can bring it back to the model to go and formulate a response with that information. Okay. So here, again, we're trying to lessen the points or reduce the places where the model could fail and replace it with more reliable services. All right, so those are some patterns to think about as you are prototyping with large language models and prompting. Where are there opportunities for future work? So again, I would argue that prompting is radically changing how quickly new AI-based prototypes can be created and tested, and by whom, in both industry and academia. Like, again, talking with folks today, like there is this explosion, even just here, of all the different ways people are applying LLMs, what they're trying to do with them and accomplish with them. I don't think this is going to go away anytime soon. Like, it is giving people these superpowers that didn't exist before. You have this whole group of people now who can do things they couldn't do before, so there's going to be a lot of creativity in this space for quite some time. The models are going to continue to improve. And like I said, it's just taking months of work. If you're pressing into minutes, like think of what you can do now with the time savings here that you couldn't do before. Given this, I think there are opportunities for augmenting the prototyping and evaluation methods that exist today, and thinking about participatory design and co-creation opportunities that exist. And this seems like a great group to kind of like riff on these ideas. So we do have things like paper prototyping. We have things like heuristic evaluation. How should these methods evolve to accommodate prompt programming and prompt prototyping? What needs to change here? What is a set of heuristics that might be useful to bring in early into the process if you're prototyping AI using prompting? How can we take something like actual paper prototyping and prompting and then bring these together into a method where they work really well together? Right? You bring in Wizard of Oz as well. How can we go and really accelerate the process of prototyping and experimenting with new AI-based functionality? As an example of where this could be useful, we did some work in the past with creating AIs, systems for pathologists to detect and grade prostate cancer. And in that process of creating an assistant to assist with that process, we created some onboarding materials so that the pathologist could learn how to use the AI more effectively and more quickly. And what we found was that when the pathologist would sit down and use the system, the AI would make mistakes that a human wouldn't make, right? Just because it's trained differently. And that was weird to them, right? Like it would, like I said, it would make mistakes like no other human would, and that confused them, and then they didn't quite know how to work with the model once they witnessed that. What we found was that if we could surface those specific issues and let them know about it before they started using the system, then they wouldn't be thrown by it, and they would be able to continue doing their work. So how can we help people identify the ways that the AI is going to behave in unexpected ways faster, so that we can accommodate that in our designs, right? So rather than waiting for the full model to be built, how can we surface these potential issues soon and then start designing for them, rather than trying to patch it and put Band-Aids on the design after the fact. Okay, I mentioned this notion of co-creation and co-design as well. This, to me, is super interesting, and I don't know of work that has started in this space, but it just seems like a natural thing to do, right? When you can spend 5 or 10 minutes to go and teach prompting to folks, why shouldn't we involve all the stakeholders? Why shouldn't we involve our target users in the process of actually designing the AI and crafting it and testing it out? It seems like such a natural thing to do. I would love to see how that process could evolve to really take advantage of that capability. All right, so some final thoughts, and you've been a quiet group, so I'm looking forward to questions you have. If you haven't used a large language model, I go to conferences now, and people ask, like, what are you up to? And we're using large language models a lot, and I ask them, have you used it? And some people, yes. Most people to date haven't used it when I've talked with folks at conferences. It's taking time for people to get hold of it, but the advice I give them is go home tonight, go to the OpenAI Playground, and start prompting, right? Just play with it to get a sense of what you might be able to do with it. Maybe you won't use it, but it is like this capability that we now have that allows us to do things much more quickly than we could do in the past. And think about how can we evolve our prototyping practice now to go and take advantage of these capabilities, and how can we further enrich the prototyping design space with large language models. So that's it. Happy to take questions from folks. You can find us at pair.withgoogle.com, and that's it. Thanks.
Hello, everyone. Great. Guys have questions? So I was going to ask you a question about how prototyping this way. I love the connection between prototyping, prompting, and prototyping. And it's super clear that you can get to a working prototype faster. And that changes the design process because you're kind of skipping over this stage of having to build the thing. Often now, let's say designers create things that kind of look like what they want, or maybe, they storyboard it to kind of put it in front of users early on. But now you're arguing we can get a working thing in front of people much faster. And so I was going to ask you a little bit about have you collected any data on how that changes interactions with users? Maybe in the types of questions that you're asking, or the types of studies that can be done earlier.
I don't have an answer to that. I think that's where there is a research opportunity, right? In the past, AI was something that it took a long time to build, and then it was fixed, right? Once you had created the model, it was hard to go and tweak it in the field. And now with prompting, you can tweak it in the field. And so that does change the dynamic. How? I'm not sure. I think
what that brings to mind is, we teach students with paper prototyping, change your paper prototype after each user, and continually adapt that. And this is really what you're able to do here, but with a working prototype.
Right. And I think to build on that, we talked about multiple alternatives as well. There could be a temptation to, in the field, just try to make the prompt better and do prompt engineering. I think you also have an opportunity to try something completely different, right? With paper prototyping, you can try something completely different. And with prompting, you can do that as well, right? And so you might be going down this path of, let's go and try to help kids write apps, HTML apps quickly by translating their natural language into code. In the field, you might find out that's a horrible idea, and instead we should be asking them what app do they want to build to help them figure out what is a good problem to solve. And you can write that a prompt to go and start having them answer questions about their app, right? And so I think it goes beyond trying to improve. It's kind of if you show a design and people are saying, oh, that font choice is not right. right? Like that's not the type of feedback you want. You want the feedback of like, this is not solving the problem that matters to me, right? And in the field, if you're learning that with the AI is not solving a problem that's useful to you, you now have the opportunity to say, okay, well, what if we solve this problem? And then to go and get a prompt that you can test out like, okay, yes, there might be something there if we try to solve it that way instead.
Questions, folks? I mean, I'll just follow up one thing and say, paper prototyping, I think what gives it its power is you can do it very quickly and like change your idea before it's set in stone. And this has that feel of it would be interesting comparison. Could you create a prompt prototype faster than a paper prototype? And if so, then, and you get more information that way, it sort of makes paper prototyping obsolete. Okay, let's get some others involved. Here.
I don't know if it's obsolete. I mean, like you're solving different problems, right? But I do think you're right in that with prompting, you haven't invested a lot of time and resources in a model, and so you're not as attached to it. You can throw it away, right? Whereas if you spent 6 months and the model does X, it's hard to say like, okay, maybe we should spend 6 months building a different model, right? So kind of getting that feedback in minutes and days, it's super invaluable.
Thanks. I can't resist asking, what makes an API AI friendly?
If you have a lot of arguments to a function, it can make it more difficult for it may make it more difficult for the model to figure out how to go and slot in information in a natural language request into the different arguments. I would say it's still an open space. Like we did some initial tests, and one of the things we found, so we created an API to interact with like a version control system like Git. And we tested variations of function names, so like really descriptive domain-specific function names. But we also said, all right, let's go and try random function names. And the model only saw the information in the prompt, and it was for an API that it had never seen before. So it wasn't like we were training it. So it only had the information in the prompt to work with. And curiously enough, when we used completely random function names, it seemed to be able to pick up and use those more easily than function names that were in the domain. And I suspect it's because it was trying to substitute function names that it had seen previously in that domain in those circumstances. Whereas if you gave it completely out-of-domain stuff, then it seemed to work better.
Personally, I need an LLM to use Git.
Yeah, no.
So I was curious how apparently everyday experiences can be used for prototyping. You were giving that example of going to the playground and starting prototyping. Would you please elaborate?
Oh, the OpenAI Playground?
Yes, so going to the playground and starting prototyping. So what would you prototype and how?
So the OpenAI Playground, I mean, it just provides an interface to their large language models. So when I showed you those examples of like, English and French, like you could type those same examples into the OpenAI Playground and then hit run and it'll come back with the text. And so it just provides that interface to go and test out your ideas. You can also, there are also APIs that you can go and programmatically access. Does that answer your question? OpenAI is its own separate company. And so, yes, it was like, I think the first company to go and externalize these access to these large language models.
I'm really interested in sort of understanding what kind of tasks like a large language model can be applied to. And I feel like, because the content you're working with, the large language model is working with is text. And text is very tolerant of errors. And because it's not structured, right? But when you're working with structured data, like you really need things to work.
Sure.
But I'm wondering whether actually the large language model can make more structured things less structured? Like, for example, if you're developing a web application and you need to read a JSON object, like if you're missing a comma, like your program won't run. But what I'm really surprised with these large language model is even if there are errors like this, it'll just it just keep going by itself, right? Just work, it can sort of handle that uncertainty a little bit. So I'm wondering, like, what's your thoughts on, how that uncertainty can be leveraged, and how do we really need to get rid of that uncertainty when we move beyond prototyping to high fidelity, product at the end?
Okay. Well, you'll probably have to follow up with some questions, additional questions there to clarify what you're interested in. But I think you're right in that they are very tolerant. And like we were doing some benchmarking in the past where we had some natural language examples, and like we had typos that we didn't realize were there, but the model had no problem with it. Like it was able to pick up on it. Like it's cool. It's very forgiving. But if you need to do something like create structured data that is conformant to a grammar, then maybe it goes and does that first pass, but then you pass it on to a tool to go and clean it up. But I do think that one of the superpowers is to go and use it as an interpreter of intent that you can then convert into more structured machine-readable formats that you can then perform computation on. I don't think that quite answers your question, so go ahead with follow-up questions.
Well, I think the core of my question is really that uncertainty, right? We can leverage it, and and then when you move from prototyping to a later high fidelity stage, or actual customer-facing products, you kind of have to get rid of all that, right? And how can these large language model be still helpful there, rather than saying like, let's write actually solid code that makes sure things, conform to a format?
I would say that probably interpreting intent is a good use in more production environments. But then using patterns like the phone a friend, where you interpret the intent, but then you go off, like you reduce the intent into a machine-readable format that then allows you to go and compute deterministically on the task and then bring that back in. I think if you're trying to rely on it, it depends on the application. Like if you're doing creative writing, it's probably fine to use it like throughout. But if you're trying to do something more precise or has some factuality requirements, you probably want to go and make use of auxiliary services to go and ensure that you're coming back with information, reliable information. I think it's better to misinterpret a request and provide reliable information than to misinterpret a request and then hallucinate information.
Got another question in the room, and then we have an online audience with questions.
Yeah.
Hello. Thank you for the talk. It was very informative for me. So I went into the OpenAI Playground just now, and I'll get to my question in a second.
Yeah.
So I asked it, okay, I have a video that I want to make a little faster, with 1 being normal speed. What is the value that I'm looking for? Give me just the number. And I think that one of the beauties of like GPT-3 is that it tends to be very chatty. ChatGPT, if you ask it a question, it'll just give you a long response. But you can also ask GPT-3 to just give me the number, right?
Right.
And you can see that you could feed this. Oh, the answer was 1.2, which is pretty good.
Yeah.
And so I gave it a non-specific value. I told it what I wanted, and it gave me a value that I can then feed into an API or like a program to speed up a video.
Yep.
So, and you can, anyone can imagine any number of ways of building a video editor with no UI.
Right.
So my question is related to the future of UI. Do you see with large language models that the UI will just be a very vague command and no buttons, no anything, just a chat box?
I mean, it's a possibility. You could go and prototype that today and see how far it gets you, right? Like I think, that's, again, the beauty of it, and really what I'm talking about here is like, if you think that is a viable form of interaction for a particular task, go test it out. Go try it right now. See if it works. Like, what do people, like, put that in front of a user and probe, what does that interaction feel like? Does it feel natural to them or not? We have done studies with things like natural language code synthesis. And it feels like it's such a natural thing, because if you're programming and you can't remember the specifics of an API, what do you do right now? Well, you go to, like, search, and you enter in your query, and you probably end up on a Stack Overflow page, and you go and get the code and drop it in. But you also need to know kind of like the granularity of the requests that the model can handle. So when we did these studies, we asked people to create a to-do app, and they had the ability to go and interact with a large language model or use search. And you would see that people would ask things like, create a to-do app for me, right? Which it sounds like, a natural thing to ask, but it's also completely underspecified, right? And the model will go and create the code. It will go and write HTML and JavaScript, but it might not be at all what you had in your head, because you're not providing a whole lot of information. And so one tricky thing is, I think, getting the right level of granularity and getting people to that place where they know what can be asked and what can't be asked, right? And so, create a to-do app for me. That's a huge request. It's underspecified. You don't have a lot of control of what's produced. But if you say, give me a drop-down box of the US states, it'll be able to do that. And that's well specified, and it can execute that well. But it takes time for people to figure out, like, where's that, what can I ask, and reliably get good feedback from, or good output from.
So I'll be the proxy for the online folks. So Ian Gross asks, so you said the design patterns of prototyping were expected to stay useful or workable for a while, right? What sort of advances in AI or whatnot might change this, and how might the patterns be adapted to that sort of thing, if you have any idea?
I think that the patterns, like, phone a friend, where you're going out to auxiliary services, are likely to remain viable for some time, because if you look at what the models are trying to do, they're trying to go and generate text that's probable given the input. And what that means is that they're prone to things like hallucination. You can counter that by giving it training data for a specific problem domain. So, like, if you scope it down and say, okay, I only want it to answer questions about HTML buttons, right? Like, you'll probably be able to get good enough training data that can reliably produce information about HTML buttons, right? And that particular pattern is no longer really that important. But in terms of how they're going to change and what other patterns might show up or go away, I don't know. I haven't given that a whole lot of thought. I think one thing that we have seen with instruction-tuned models like ChatGPT is that it does change how you can prompt. So previously, you might enter in text like translate hello into French, and write that in there with a period, and the model wouldn't return anything, or it'd return like number one or something like that. It wouldn't actually follow that request, because like, where would you see that sentence in the training data? You might see it on a test, right, where you're asking like someone to go and translate that into French, but the test wouldn't have the answer because it's a test. With the instruction-tuned models, now it's much more likely that you could go and say, translate that into French, and then it actually produces the correct response. And so I think you have seen that with the recent models, that you can have more of these zero-shot requests rather than few-shot examples to go and get a particular result. So kind of a non-answer. Like, I think it's a good question. I don't know exactly what might change in terms of the models that would change the prompt prototyping patterns.
Yeah, so in your first few examples, you have, right, the French word for apple. I don't need to know anything about French in order to request that, and then it will give me the word for it. But the Python example you gave was open a file for writing. If I didn't know Python, I might not know that I need to open a file specifically with that write flag. And I'm just curious, do you think that we need to, especially if we're trying to make this accessible and open it up, are there probably things that we need to do to these LLMs to make it so that they can not only do what is being asked, but also help educate how to actually use me?
Yeah, no, great question. And I think that, so to connect a few things in the talk, and at the risk of being repetitive, you can test it out. Like, do people actually want that? Do they need that, right? And if they do, you can start prototyping that. And I think in that case, like, if they want that explanation, you can figure out how can I go and get that information and bring it back in, right? You can probably, as a first approximation, have the model go in and produce that explanation. But then if you want to be able to more reliably produce that explanation, you can figure out what resources could I go to go and get that information and then bring it back.
You want to, like, in a way, prompt the human.
Yeah.
Like, what would you prompt the AI, and the AI gives you a response back, along with prompts, like, oh, did you want to, do you need to know more about that? Or, hey, you think about asking this?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I thought, yes. So there's also the possibility of having a prompt write a prompt that the model interprets. So you can get recursive. So the WordCraft app that I talked about, I think they had a flavor of this, of like, what things should I ask about in the story right now that I'm writing, and then it will produce some things, and then it could go and then have the model answer those questions. So it's like a multi-step process where you're first asking it to go and comment on the story, and then to go and act on the comments.
Yeah, thank you for the great talk. So my question is, so in the design thinking process, we often begin with empathize with users, and then define a problem, right? And then we go into ideation and prototyping and so on, right? So I guess my question is, have you thought about how large language model might fit into the early stage, or is it just going to be, because it's so easy to prototype, like get into prototyping right away, would it be something like we just prototype and then ask them like, oh, how does it feel? And then maybe, it's like now empathizing and actually like defining a problem actually happens, as you try to get some feedback from them, right? Have you thought about, how it might influence the whole practice, or?
I think we talked a bit about this in some earlier conversations today, where you might be able to ask the model, like, who should I be thinking about talking to when I'm working on this design, right? And so you might, like, you can look at the prototyping process and ask, what parts right now are there, where are there points of friction, and how might the model help to remove some of that friction, right? And so maybe, I don't want to talk to lots of people because I don't want to spend time thinking like, who are all the different people I should think about. But if I can ask the model, like, it might save me some work and then increase the chance that I start adopting different perspectives at the very least when I'm thinking through my design.
Can I just add? So another thing was, I think, like, defining a problem is actually, or framing a problem in different ways can be really important, right? And I was wondering, because large language models are trained on existing text, and sometimes what we want is this creative framing of a problem. And I feel like it's important to also think about, right? Like, can we use large language model to help us like come up with creative freedom framing, or like if we just use it and ask like, oh, like what would be the friction? Would it just repeat something that we already know, or
Right.
Yeah.
So I think where you're pointing out are a couple different conceptual ways of thinking how to use the model. One is you could have it try to act like a collaborator, where it's taking your idea and then reframing it or adding to it or whatnot, right? And so asking it to actually generate content. Another way is, it's still kind of like thinking like a collaborator, but having the model ask you things, right? Like, have you thought about, talking to these people, right? And so try to think of like, what role is it playing? Are you trying to lean on it to generate ideas that you're not going to get, or are you using it as an aid to help you think through the process? Right? So is it generating content, or is it helping you with process? I think there's value in both. I'm kind of interested in thinking about that process of like, how can it help you be better, as opposed to leaning on it to come up with like the next amazing idea.
So we're doing a lot of prototyping. Where's the marketplace? Is it mostly going to be like subscription service, like pay for DALL-E, like pay for a word generator, pay to access GPT? Or are we going to like buy a model for our home? Are we going to have like a home unit? Where do you think it might end up as a market?
I don't know. Yeah, I think that's being figured out in real time.
There's a lot of subscription stuff,
Yeah.
DALL-E and so forth. And there's a lot of free things too.
Yeah, I think that's kind of like fun speculation over a beer. But I don't think I'm going to go on record of like trying to predict where the marketplace is going to be, because what's that?
Yeah, ask the model to tell us.
Yeah, just ask the model where. How are you going to be profitable? Yeah.
Hi, I'm curious. So we all know that LLMs are not perfect right now, and I feel that HCI researchers have come up with workarounds to try to address some issues. So I'm curious about like what current issues of LLMs you think that are more temporary, and which ones are more fundamental and will be like permanent issues that LLMs have, and as designers or researchers we should be aware of.
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think hallucinations, like given the current architecture of the models, hallucinations are something that likely to be around for a while. I think, again, restricting the model to a specific problem space and giving it training data to fine tune it will help reduce the likelihood of those. But like fundamentally, they're just predicting like the next probable tokens based on what's already been input. And then the first part of your question, remind me again. The first part one of your question?
The temporary.
Oh yeah, so what is temporary? Yeah, great. Okay, so I gave that example earlier of, translate hello into French. And before we had instruction-tuned models, that may not work. Like it may not produce the result that you want. Now there's been a lot of training data collected by OpenAI to come up with better responses when you give it an instruction. And so I think in understanding the user's likely intent is like initially when they came out, there were problems, right? Like it didn't work well. But more training data has been collected and tuned for those types of interactions, and so they work better. Another way to think about this is like when you go and train the large language model on a corpus, the inputs and outputs, the inputs are likely to be a different statistical distribution than the inputs used in practice, right? And so you like train on a corpus of web text as an example, but then web text is not interacting with the model. People are. And they're going to have different types of inputs and requests and things that they ask of the model that then will be found in the data it was trained on. And so there's this cold start problem where initially it's not going to perhaps understand all of your requests. But then as you get more training data for how it's actually used in practice, then it becomes better at interpreting it and acting on your input. A question back there too?
Systems have built-in fact-checking, or do you have to do the fact-checking? Thank you.
Yeah, so do these systems have built-in fact-checking, and do you have to do fact-checking? When you look at the architecture, like the canonical architecture that is used is the transformer model, and it's just learning to predict the next likely token or word based on the input it's already received. So the base model, the basic model that's used doesn't have fact-checking built into it.
I had a question.
Yes.
Personally. So a lot of work that we do in this lab is kind of community-driven and community design. It's working with communities, like, for example, like looking at public transportation, you're looking at all the stakeholders, the trolley and Uber drivers and taxi drivers. And you made a really cool, interesting point about using prompt prototypes as kind of these interactive boundary objects between collaborators who have ML technical background versus people who don't. And I'm curious, like, how would it look if you deploy something like Promptmaker or to the community and they could tweak it or give feedback on those prototypes and use it as kind of a boundary object that interacts with the community as a whole?
So the application or the prompts, or like which is the boundary object in your question?
So I was thinking of kind of both. It would be the original app that was envisioned by the original creator. Then it's almost deployed to this community. The community can use prompts to iterate on it and give feedback as well.
That's really interesting. So, one of the things that I think helped aid the success of the web was that you had the page, but you could always go and view source code, right? And so you could learn from that. And you can ask, like, can you go and create prototypes where you can view source code, but the source code is the prompt, and people can then go and change it, right? So like if you deploy a prototype, can you make it easy for people to look at the prompt that's being used and then go and tweak it? That's cool and that's fun, and it allows them to kind of like test out different ideas. Like maybe it's not working for them and they can go and change it. It's an interesting challenge to think about how you could do that so that they can do more than just improve it. Like they can actually try out a completely different type of interaction or capability that's being provided by the model, right? Because you still have the prototype there, and you're going to have a limit, maybe some limitations in terms of what you can change in terms of the interaction of the entire app. But at least you can go and tweak and play around with the prompt a bit. I mean, but like maybe that's not that big of a deal. Maybe like once they see the prompt and they realize I can change that, maybe it's enough for them to go either change it there or in like OpenAI Playground and be like, you know what if we tried this instead, right? And so that might be enough just for them to empower them to go and create an alternative idea for the designers to consider.
Good time for one more.
Oh wow, there's a whole bunch of hands. Three. Yeah.
Okay. I'm curious, like, in terms of language, so this is a whole lot about like large language-based models. So what if like, I feel like using ChatGPT is all about like based on English, but then like, what if like, so language is developed by as culture is developing. Yeah. So what are you like drawing like in the future, like as the globalization is coming to, like ongoing to, so like what would be the future of like this language-based models, like in terms of like combination of all languages?
Right.
Yeah.
So like that's a nice open-ended question. I'm trying to figure out like how to answer it. So is the question like, is it possible to have multiple languages put into the model and train it? Is that the question? I don't think. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and also like, what would like that machine can reconfigure of like our like users, like users' brain, like, and like how do they like use the machine? It's kind of like a vague question. Yeah. So I feel like language is really like interesting part that we're using it. Right. So the combination of language and like all the users from like global users, how does the machine can change the all the global users, maybe?
So how are these things going to change how people think and act and so on? Yeah, I think that's another great question to speculate over beer. It's hard to know, right? It's like when the web first came out, you could ask like, well, how's the web going to change things? And I don't think anyone knew, like, could have predicted everything that's changed. It'll be fun to watch it play out, for sure.
Hello. I was curious to hear more about the framework and approach of the onboarding for the pathologists, and if any of that could be generalized to anyone using AI systems.
Yes, please read the paper. No, I think I was talking with some folks earlier about this too. So if you're creating a system like that helps to detect and rate cancer, and you're expecting pathologists to use it, it's changing their practice, right? It's providing information that they didn't have before and they weren't trained to use. And so you need to think about how can you design that interaction so that the end result is improved compared to what it was before. And so a lot of it is just figuring out what information do they need and is useful. In our case with the pathologists, they wanted to know how does the model compare to me? How does it compare to my colleagues? Who provided the training data? Like, where were they from? Because different pathologists will have different tendencies, and they wanted to know what tendencies were in the model. What we found was that there were some cases where the model was going to be more accurate than the pathologist. And so one of the instructions we gave them with the onboarding was, when you find yourself disagreeing with the model in this case, think twice, because the model tends to be more accurate in this case than the people. But we had to first figure out where was the model better compared to the person, in addition to surfacing the AI weirdness stuff, and then crystallize that into specific instructions that they could use and make use of when they use the AI system.